The funeral home smelled of artificial flowers and regret. Caitlin Matthews stood at the polished oak coffin, her fingers tracing the cold metal handles as she tried to reconcile the peaceful face of her stepfather with the storm of emotions churning inside her. At 32, she'd become an expert at maintaining composure, a skill honed through years of night shifts at Memorial Regional Hospital and raising her son alone. But today, that carefully constructed facade was cracking. "He looks almost peaceful, doesn't he?" The voice came from behind her, smooth as aged whiskey but laced with something darker. Evan Blackwood, her stepfather's protege and closest confidant, moved to stand beside her. His expensive suit seemed out of place in the modest funeral home, much like the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Nothing about this feels peaceful, Evan." Caitlin's voice remained steady, though her hands had begun to tremble. The past week had been a blur of arrangements and paperwork, punctuated by mysterious phone calls and whispered conversations that fell silent when she entered rooms. Her son, Tommy, sat in the corner, his 10-year-old frame hunched over a comic book. He hadn't cried, not yet. Sometimes Caitlin caught him staring at Richard's coffin with an expression that seemed too old for his face, as if he understood more than he should about the undercurrents of adult deception. "Your mother would have wanted you to be here," Evan continued, his words carrying a weight that made Caitlin's spine stiffen. "Though I wonder if Richard would have said the same." The implicit accusation hung in the air between them. Caitlin had spent the last 5 years distancing herself from her stepfather's increasingly erratic behavior, his late-night phone calls, and the mysterious meetings that left him agitated and defensive. Now, standing in the oppressive quiet of the funeral home, she wondered if she should have pushed harder for answers. "I was here when it mattered," she replied, though the words felt hollow. The truth was more complicated. She'd been working a double shift when Richard had his heart attack, and by the time she'd reached the hospital, Evan had already been there for hours, huddled with lawyers in the waiting room. The funeral director approached, his practiced sympathy a temporary reprieve from the tension. "Ms. Matthews, we need to discuss the final arrangements." As Caitlin followed him to his office, she felt Evan's eyes boring into her back. The small office was cluttered with papers and photographs of grieving families, a gallery of loss that now included her own fractured family portrait. "There's been a slight complication," the director began, shuffling through a stack of papers. "Mr. Blackwood has already handled most of the arrangements. He had power of attorney in Mr. Crawford's final days." The words hit Caitlin like a physical blow. "Power of attorney? That's impossible. I was Richard's next of kin." The director's discomfort was palpable. "The paperwork was filed last week, just before." He trailed off, sliding a document across the desk. Caitlin's hands shook as she read the dates. 3 days before Richard's death, he had signed over significant legal authority to Evan. The signature at the bottom of the page looked shaky, almost forced. "There's more," the director added hesitantly. "Mr. Blackwood has requested that the reading of the will take place immediately following the service tomorrow." Outside the office, Tommy had abandoned his comic book and was standing by Richard's coffin, his small hand resting where hers had been moments before. Evan stood nearby, speaking softly to the boy, and something in his posture made Caitlin's maternal instincts flare with warning. As she watched, Evan placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, leaning down to whisper something in his ear. The boy's eyes widened, and he looked quickly at his mother before pulling away from Evan's touch. That evening, as Caitlin tucked Tommy into bed in their small apartment above Main Street Pharmacy, he finally spoke about the funeral home. "Mom, Mr. Blackwood said Grandpa Richard left us a surprise. But he said sometimes surprises can hurt worse than just knowing the truth." Caitlin felt a chill run through her body. "What else did he say to you, honey?" Tommy rolled over, pulling his blanket tight around his shoulders. "He said we should be careful what we wish for. That sometimes when you dig for treasure, you find bones instead." Long after Tommy had fallen asleep, Caitlin sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by old family photos and the nagging sensation that she was missing something crucial. Her mother's death 3 years ago had left so many questions unanswered, and now Richard had taken even more secrets to his grave. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Some inheritances come with strings attached. Be smart tomorrow, Caitlin. Walk away while you still can. She deleted the message, but its warning echoed in her mind as she tried to sleep. Tomorrow would bring Richard's final farewell, but something told her it was just the beginning of a much darker story, one that had been waiting years to be told. In the darkness of her bedroom, Caitlin could almost hear her mother's voice, warning her about the price of truth. But as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she knew she had no choice. Whatever Richard had been hiding, whatever game Evan was playing, she had to protect her son, even if it meant unraveling every careful lie her family had ever told. The morning of the funeral dawned with the kind of pristine clarity that felt almost offensive in its beauty. Caitlin stood before her bathroom mirror, fingers fumbling with the buttons of her black blouse, while her mind wandered through a maze of half-formed theories and lingering doubts. The anonymous text from the night before had left her sleep fractured and uneasy, like a finger pressing against a bruise she hadn't known was there. Mom. Tommy's voice drifted through the door. Can you help me with my tie? The simple request anchored her, as it always did. Tommy had become her compass over the years, pointing true north when everything else spun into chaos. She opened the door to find him already dressed in his small suit, the navy tie hanging loose around his neck like a question mark. Come here, buddy. She knelt, her fingers working through the familiar motions. Remember what I taught you about making a tie knot? Over, under, through the loop, he recited, but his eyes were distant. Mom, did Grandpa Richard love us? The question caught her off guard, stabbing through her carefully maintained composure. Love is complicated, Tommy. Sometimes people show it in strange ways. She smoothed his collar, buying time. Why do you ask? I found this in my backpack after the funeral home. He pulled out a folded envelope, slightly crumpled. Mr. Blackwood put it there. He said Grandpa Richard wanted me to have it, but I should wait to show you. Caitlin's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Inside was a photograph she'd never seen before, Richard standing with a group of men in business suits, all wearing satisfied smiles. On the back, in Richard's precise handwriting, The Price of Silence, 1992. Below it, in fresher ink, Some debts can never be repaid. The church service passed in a blur of hymns and hollow condolences. Caitlin sat in the front pew, Tommy pressed against her side, while Evan commanded attention from the pulpit with a eulogy that painted Richard as a pillar of the community, a man of unwavering principles. Each word felt like a carefully placed brick in a wall of deception. Richard Crawford was more than a businessman, Evan's voice carried through the chapel. He was a keeper of secrets, a man who understood that sometimes the greatest mercy lies in what remains unsaid. Caitlin caught the subtle emphasis, the way Evan's eyes found hers across the congregation. The photograph burned in her purse like a hot coal. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 o'clock at Richard's attorney's office, a weathered brick building that had stood on Main Street longer than Caitlin had been alive. The conference room smelled of leather and old paper, its walls lined with law books that seemed to watch the proceedings with dusty indifference. Before we begin, Harrison Walsh, Richard's attorney of 30 years, cleared his throat. I should note that there are 2 versions of the will. The first was drafted 5 years ago, the second. He paused, adjusting his glasses, just 4 days before Richard's passing. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Caitlin felt rather than saw Evan shift in his chair beside her. The more recent version makes significant changes to the distribution of assets, Walsh continued, his voice carefully neutral. Mr. Blackwood is named as primary beneficiary of Crawford Industries and the majority of Richard's personal estate. The words hit like physical blows, each one driving the air from Caitlin's lungs. That's impossible, she managed. Richard promised, my mother's share of the company was transferred to Mr. Blackwood's control last week, Walsh finished, sliding a document across the table. along with the house on Maple Street and the summer property in Vermont. Tommy's small hand found hers under the table, squeezing with a strength that surprised her. In that moment, she felt the weight of his trust, his unconscious faith that she would find a way through this maze of adult betrayal. "There's a condition," Evan spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Caitlin receives a monthly stipend for Tommy's care, provided she signs a non-disclosure agreement regarding certain aspects of Richard's business dealings." "And if I refuse?" Evan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'm afraid there's nothing." Richard was very clear about that. The drive home was silent, heavy with unasked questions. Tommy fell asleep in the back seat, leaving Caitlin alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that she was missing crucial pieces of a puzzle that had been years in the making. She pulled into their apartment's parking lot just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. As she helped a drowsy Tommy from the car, a figure stepped out from behind the stairwell, Molly Chen, her best friend since nursing school, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Kate," Molly's voice was urgent, "I need to tell you something. About Richard, and what really happened last week." Before she could continue, a car door slammed nearby. Evan emerged from the shadows, his presence an implicit threat. "Evening, ladies. Lovely service today, wasn't it? Molly, I believe we had an agreement about conversations like this." Molly's face drained of color. She backed away, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, Kate. I'm so sorry." She hurried to her car, leaving Caitlin with the distinct impression that her list of allies was growing dangerously short. That night, after Tommy was asleep, Caitlin sat at her kitchen table with Richard's photograph propped against a cold cup of coffee. The men's faces stared back at her, their smiles holding secrets she was only beginning to understand. Her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number, "Check the house on Maple Street. Second floor study, behind the painting of the lighthouse. But hurry, some things aren't meant to stay buried forever." As she traced the edges of the photograph, Caitlin felt something shift inside her, a quiet resolve crystallizing into determination. Tomorrow, she would begin her own investigation, starting with the house she'd grown up in. Whatever truth lay hidden behind that lighthouse painting, she was done being a passive player in someone else's game. The night stretched out before her, full of possibilities and dangers she couldn't yet name. But for the first time since Richard's death, she felt something like hope, or perhaps it was simply the fierce satisfaction of finally choosing to fight back. The house on Maple Street stood silent in the pre-dawn light, its Victorian facades holding memories like pressed flowers between pages. Caitlin sat in her car, watching the first hints of sunrise paint the windows in shades of amber and gold. She dropped Tommy at school early, telling him she had errands to run. The partial truth sat heavy in her stomach, another compromise in a growing list of necessary deceptions. Her old key still worked in the front door lock, though it stuck slightly, as if the house itself was reluctant to admit her. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and dried roses, exactly as it had during her mother's time. Richard had never changed anything after her death, preserving the space like a museum of their shared past. "What were you hiding?" Caitlin whispered to the empty halls. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as she climbed the stairs to the second-floor study. Family photos lined the stairwell, carefully curated moments of happiness that now felt like elaborate props in a stage play she hadn't known she was part of. The lighthouse painting hung exactly where it always had, watching over Richard's massive oak desk like a silent sentinel. Caitlin's hands trembled as she lifted it from the wall, revealing a wall safe she'd never known existed. The combination lock stared back at her, as inscrutable as Richard himself had been in his final days. She sat in Richard's leather chair, allowing herself to absorb the weight of the moment. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the desk's polished surface. A memory surfaced, Richard sitting here on her wedding day, writing something in his journal while her mother adjusted her veil in the next room. "The date," she murmured, suddenly sitting up straight. Her wedding date, Richard had used it for everything, claiming he never wanted to forget the day his family became complete. For quick turns of the dial, and the safe clicked open with a sound like a held breath finally released. Inside lay a leather-bound journal and a stack of documents held together with a faded rubber band. The journal's pages were filled with Richard's precise handwriting, each entry dated and methodically organized. Caitlin began to read, and with each page, she felt the foundations of her world shift slightly beneath her feet. June 15, 1992. The deal is done. God forgive me, but I had no choice. Margaret doesn't know, can never know, what I've sacrificed to keep our family safe. Blackwood made the terms clear, my silence for their protection. Some burdens are meant to be carried alone. September 3, 1994. Evan shows promise, but there's something in his eyes that reminds me too much of his father. The same hunger, the same disregard for consequences. He's asking questions about the old files, about the accident at the plant. I've moved everything to the lake house. Some secrets need deeper water. The entries continued, painting a picture of decades-long deception. Richard had been protecting something, or someone, at a cost that went beyond mere money. References to the agreement and Blackwood's terms appeared repeatedly, along with mentions of a fire that had claimed lives, a cover-up that had made fortunes. A noise downstairs jolted Caitlin from her reading. Footsteps, too heavy to ignore, moved through the foyer. She quickly photographed several pages of the journal with her phone, then returned everything to the safe except a single envelope that caught her eye, addressed to her mother but never sent. The study door opened just as she locked the safe and rehung the painting. Evan stood in the doorway, his expression a careful mask of concern. I thought I might find you here, he said, moving into the room with the casual confidence of someone who already owned it. Going through dear old Dad's things. Some might consider that trespassing. It's still my family home, Caitlin replied, though they both knew it wasn't true anymore. I have a right to my own history. History? Evan's laugh held no humor. History is written by the survivors, Caitlin. By the ones willing to do what's necessary. He moved closer, picking up a framed photo from the desk, Caitlin's mother on her wedding day, Richard beaming beside her. Your mother understood that, in the end. She made her choice, just like Richard did. What's that supposed to mean? It means you should be careful what you go looking for. He set the photo down with deliberate care. Some questions are better left unasked. For Tommy's sake, if not your own. The mention of her son sent a chill through Caitlin's body. Leave him out of this. I wish I could. Evan's voice softened with what might have been genuine regret. But we're all part of this now. Richard made sure of that with his last signature. He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. Speaking of which, I have something you might want to see. Inside was a series of bank statements, transactions between Richard and an offshore account, regular payments spanning years. The most recent transfer had been made the day before his death, for an amount that made Caitlin's head spin. He was protecting someone, Evan said quietly. The question is, who was he protecting them from? He let the question hang in the air between them. Think carefully about your next move, Caitlin. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. After he left, Caitlin remained in the study, her mother's unopened letter burning a hole in her pocket. Through the window, she watched Evan's car pull away, its tires crunching on the gravel drive. The morning light had shifted, throwing the room's shadows into sharp relief. Her phone buzzed, a text from Molly, meet me at the Blue Cup Cafe. 3 p.m. There's something you need to know about the night Richard died. Come alone. Caitlin touched the letter in her pocket, feeling the weight of unspoken words beneath the paper. Whatever truth lay hidden in these family shadows, she was done being afraid of the dark. It was time to step into it, eyes wide open, and find out exactly what kind of legacy Richard had really left behind. The Blue Cup Cafe sat on the corner of Pine and Fourth, its faded awning fluttering in the afternoon breeze like a tired flag of surrender. Caitlin arrived early, choosing a booth near the back where she could watch both the door and the street beyond. The letter from the study burned in her purse, still unopened, a weight she wasn't quite ready to bear. She ordered coffee she wouldn't drink, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on her water glass. Each ripple felt like another moment of her life being rewritten, the familiar narrative of her childhood dissolving into something darker and more complex. Molly arrived at precisely 3, her nurse's punctuality unchanged despite everything else that had shifted between them. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by whatever knowledge she carried. The afternoon light caught the silver threading through her dark hair. When had that happened? Caitlin wondered how many other changes she'd missed while navigating her own struggles. "I didn't think you'd come," Molly said, sliding into the booth. Her hands shook as she arranged her purse, her napkin, her silverware, small attempts at order in a world spinning out of control. "You were my mother's nurse in the end," Caitlin replied quietly. "And my best friend for 15 years. I had to come." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Molly's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "What I'm about to tell you, it changes everything. Not just about Richard's death, but about your mother's too." A waitress approached with coffee, but Molly waved her away. "I was there that night, Kate. Not just as a nurse. Richard had called me specifically, asked me to be present for a meeting. He said." She swallowed hard. "He said it was time to make things right." The cafe's ambient noise faded to a distant hum as Molly continued. "He was going to tell you everything. About the company, about your real father, about what happened to your mother. He had documents, proof of things that would have destroyed not just Evan, but half the town's most respected families." "My real father?" The words felt foreign on Caitlin's tongue, like speaking a language she'd never learned. "James McKenna," Molly said softly. "Richard's former business partner. The one who died in the plant fire in '92. She reached across the table, her fingers cool against Caitlin's wrist. "The fire that wasn't an accident." The world tilted slightly on its axis. Caitlin thought of the photograph from Richard's study, the men's smiling faces, the date on the back. The price of silence. Richard protected you all these years, from the truth, from Evan's father, from the consequences of what they'd done. The monthly payments weren't blackmail, Kate. They were going into a trust for you and Tommy, filtered through offshore accounts to keep them hidden from the Blackwoods. Understanding bloomed like a dark flower. And when Evan found out, he moved fast. Used Richard's medication against him, not enough to kill, just enough to confuse. Made him sign papers while he was disoriented. I should have stopped it, should have said something, but... Molly's voice cracked. They knew about David. Your son. What does he have to do with this? His scholarship, his medical school acceptance, all arranged by the Blackwoods. One word from Evan, and David's future disappears. Molly's shoulders slumped. I'm so sorry, Kate. We all made choices we thought would protect our children. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across their booth. Outside, life continued its normal rhythm, people walking dogs, checking phones, living in a world where family histories stayed safely buried. There's more, Molly said, her voice barely a whisper. Your mother, her illness wasn't natural. She found something, documents about the fire. She was going to expose everything. Then suddenly she got sick, and Richard. She stopped, horror dawning in her eyes as she looked past Caitlin's shoulder. Evan stood at the cafe's entrance, his presence casting a shadow longer than the setting sun could justify. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, Caitlin saw something shift in his expression, the mask of civilized concern giving way to something colder and more primitive. I have to go, Molly stood abruptly, gathering her things with trembling hands. I've said too much already. Be careful, Kate. Watch Tommy. They won't hesitate to use him against you, just like they're using David against me. After Molly hurried away, Caitlin remained in the booth, her mother's unopened letter now a burning brand against her skin. The cafe's sounds washed over her, clinking cups, murmured conversations, the soft hiss of the espresso machine. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, while her world reconstructed itself around devastating truths. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tommy's school. Ms. Matthews, please call regarding Tommy's early pickup by Mr. Blackwood. Ice flooded her veins as she grabbed her purse and keys. The game had changed, shifting from hidden histories to present dangers. As she rushed to her car, another text arrived from the unknown number, Lake House. East Dock. Midnight. Bring the letter. Time to finish what your mother started. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold as Caitlin drove toward Tommy's school, her hands steady on the wheel despite the tremors in her heart. She was done being a pawn in other people's games, done watching history repeat its darkest patterns. It was time to write a new ending, not just for herself, but for Tommy, for her mother, for all the lives broken by decades of carefully maintained lies. The truth about her father, about the fire, about her mother's death, all of it would come to light. But first, she had to protect her son. The lake house emerged from the gathering darkness like a memory taking shape, its weathered shutters and wraparound porch unchanged since Caitlin's childhood summers. Tommy slept in the back seat, exhausted from the afternoon's fear and confusion. She'd reached the school just in time, Evan's attempt to collect him thwarted by an attentive secretary who'd insisted on following proper protocols. Caitlin sat in the darkened car, watching moonlight ripple across the water. Her mother's letter lay open on the passenger seat, its contents finally revealed in the harsh fluorescent light of a gas station bathroom during their hurried drive north. The words still echoed in her mind, each one a key unlocking doors she hadn't known existed in her heart. My dearest Caitlin. By the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. The choices we make to protect those we love sometimes become the very things that destroy us. Your father, your real father, was a good man. James McKenna died trying to expose a truth that would have saved lives, and I've carried that burden in silence for too long. Richard isn't the man you think he is, but neither is he the villain of this story. We're all caught in a web of choices made decades ago, each thread binding us tighter with every passing year. The evidence is in the lake house, hidden where only a daughter who spent summers hunting for seashells would think to look. Love isn't always clean or simple. Sometimes it's protecting someone from a truth they're not ready to face. Sometimes it's staying silent when speaking would tear apart everything they believe in. But there comes a moment when silence becomes a poison, when protection becomes prison. You're stronger than I ever was, my girl. Strong enough to face the truth, to break these chains of silence that have bound our family for generations. Remember the lighthouse, and what lies beneath. All my love. Mom. The letter had changed everything and nothing. It confirmed what Molly had revealed, but more importantly, it awakened something in Caitlin that had been dormant for too long, a fierce determination that felt like coming home to herself. She glanced at Tommy in the rearview mirror, his face peaceful in sleep, untroubled by the weight of inherited secrets. In that moment, she understood her mother's choices with a clarity that brought tears to her eyes. Protection wasn't just about physical safety, it was about preserving innocence until strength could grow to match truth. The east dock stretched into the dark water, moonlight painting its wooden planks silver. Caitlin lifted Tommy gently from the car, carrying him into the lake house and laying him on the familiar old couch. He stirred briefly, murmuring something about sandcastles before drifting deeper into dreams. In the kitchen, everything remained exactly as she remembered, the collection of chipped mugs, the drawer that always stuck, the window that framed the lighthouse across the lake like a postcard from the past. But now she saw it all with new eyes, understanding that familiarity could be both comfort and camouflage. She remembered summers spent searching for shells with her mother, their special spot beneath the old oak tree where they'd built elaborate stories around each discovery. "Remember the lighthouse," her mother had written. Not the painting in Richard's study, the actual lighthouse, visible across the water, and the miniature replica they'd buried in their secret place all those years ago. The night air carried the scent of pine and lake water as Caitlin made her way to the oak tree. The ground was soft beneath her hands as she dug, memories rising with each handful of earth. The small ceramic lighthouse emerged slowly, its tiny windows dark with decades of buried secrets. Inside, rolled tightly and sealed in plastic, were documents that made her hands tremble, photographs of the plant fire, medical reports, death certificates with causes carefully amended, bank statements showing a pattern of payoffs and cover-ups stretching back 30 years. And newspaper clippings about James McKenna, the man who had been her father, whose death had been no accident. A twig snapped behind her. "I wondered if you'd figure it out." Evan's voice emerged from the darkness, followed by his silhouette. "Your mother always said you were clever. Too clever, sometimes, for your own good." Caitlin rose slowly, documents clutched to her chest. "It's over, Evan. All of it, the lies, the cover-ups, everything. Nothing's over until I say it is." He moved closer, moonlight catching the metal in his hand. "Richard tried to end it too, you know. That's what the heart attack was for, a warning that became necessary when warnings weren't enough. My father died trying to expose the truth. My mother died protecting me from it. I won't let their sacrifices be for nothing." "Sacrifices?" Evan's laugh was bitter. "You don't know the meaning of the word. My father built this town, built everything you see. Your father was going to destroy it all with his self-righteous crusade. Richard understood what had to be done. He made his choice. And now I'm making mine." Caitlin's voice was steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Tommy's safe. The documents are safe. And in an hour, everything goes public unless I make a call to stop it." For the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker across Evan's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I? I learned from the best, years of watching Richard and your father build their empire on secrets and lies. But here's the difference, Evan." She took a step forward, feeling stronger with each word. "I'm not afraid anymore. Not of you, not of the truth, not of what happens next." The weight of generations of secrets hung in the air between them, thick as the mist rising off the lake. In the distance, the lighthouse beam swept across the water, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat, like truth finding its way home through darkness. "It's your choice now," Caitlin said softly. "But whatever you decide, this story ends tonight." The lighthouse beam swept across the water one final time before dawn began painting the eastern sky in watercolor shades of hope. Caitlin stood at the edge of the dock, watching ripples distort the lake's mirror surface, each wave carrying away another piece of the life she thought she knew. Behind her, the lake house stood silent, holding the night's revelations in its weathered walls. The confrontation with Evan had ended not with violence, but with something more profound, the quiet collapse of a legacy built on shifting sands of deception. When faced with the weight of evidence and the strength of her resolve, his carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the frightened son still trying to protect his father's tainted empire. "Your father," he'd said finally, lowering the gun, "James McKenna, he was right about everything. The chemical dumping, the covered-up deaths, all of it. My father couldn't let the truth come out, couldn't bear to see his life's work destroyed by conscience." The confession had spilled from him like water from a broken dam, years of carried guilt finding release in the pre-dawn darkness. Richard's role, her mother's discovery, the slow poisoning meant to silence her, each revelation had fallen like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Caitlin had believed about her family's history. Now, standing at the water's edge, she felt the weight of choice pressing against her chest. The documents were safe, delivered to trusted hands during the night. By noon, the story would break, not just locally, but nationally. Lives would be upended, reputations destroyed, a carefully maintained facade of respectability shattered beyond repair. But this morning wasn't about destruction. As Caitlin watched the sun rise over the lake her parents had loved, she understood that ending the cycle of secrets was really about beginning something new. Tommy emerged from the lake house, sleep-rumpled and beautiful in the morning light. He came to stand beside her, his small hand finding hers with unconscious trust. "Are we going home now, Mom?" Home. The word held different meaning now, freed from the shadows of inheritance and obligation. "Yes, baby. But first, there's something I want to show you." She led him to the old oak tree, where the earth still bore traces of her midnight excavation. Together, they knelt in the soft dirt, and Caitlin began to tell him a story, not about betrayal or revenge, but about love that survived secrets, about a grandfather who died protecting the truth, about a grandmother whose strength ran deeper than anyone had known. "Your grandma used to say that family isn't about blood or names," she told him, watching understanding bloom in his young face. "It's about the choices we make, the truths we're willing to stand for." As the morning progressed, decisions were made with quiet certainty. The lake house would be sold, its proceeds dedicated to a foundation in James McKenna's name, supporting whistleblowers and environmental protection. The truth about the plant fire and its victims would finally be told, bringing closure to families who had spent decades wondering about their losses. Evan would face justice, but not destruction. In the end, his confession and cooperation would help heal wounds that had festered for generations. The Blackwood Empire would crumble, but from its ruins, something honest could grow. When Molly arrived later that morning, carrying coffee and tearful apologies, Caitlin embraced her with newfound understanding. "We all did what we thought we had to," she said softly. "Now we do better." The days that followed brought chaos and revelation, as truths long buried came to light. But amid the media storm and legal proceedings, Caitlin found herself centered in a calm she hadn't known was possible. The weight of inheritance, not money or property, but the burden of generational secrets, had finally lifted. She didn't keep Richard's money or the house on Maple Street. Instead, she used her portion of the settlement to buy a small cottage near the hospital where she worked, its garden already sprouting new life through old soil. Tommy helped her plant flowers in the front yard, each seed a small act of faith in the future. One evening, as autumn painted the world in shades of transformation, Caitlin sat on their new porch, watching Tommy build elaborate worlds in the garden. Her mother's letter lay in her lap, its truths now a compass rather than a burden. "Mom," Tommy called, holding up a handful of earth with a seedling pushing through, "look what's growing." Caitlin smiled, recognizing in his discovery the same wonder she'd once felt hunting for shells by the lake. Some legacies, she had learned, were worth passing on, not the weight of secrets or the poison of lies, but the simple joy of truth taking root and growing toward light. The sun set behind their little house, painting the sky in colors of ending and beginning. Caitlin thought of her father, the man she'd never known but whose courage had shaped her life. She thought of her mother, whose love had protected her until she was strong enough to protect herself. She thought of Richard, who had tried, in his broken way, to make amends for ancient wrongs. But mostly, she thought about tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, days no longer shadowed by the past, but bright with the possibility of writing her own story, page by honest page. Some inheritances, she had learned, weren't about what was left behind, but about what you chose to carry forward. She had chosen truth, chosen healing, chosen to break the cycle of secrets that had bound her family for generations. And in that choice, she had found not just justice, but something far more precious, the freedom to begin again, to build something new from the ashes of what was lost, to show her son that the greatest legacy any parent could leave was the courage to live in truth. The evening settled around them like a gentle blessing, and Caitlin felt the future unfold before her, not as a burden to be carried, but as a path to be walked, step by honest step, into the light of a new day.